Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that sounds like, well, honestly, it sounds a little bit like a detective novel. We're talking about hidden connections between cheetahs, Waldorf schools, and even the opioid crisis.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, right? All those things are connected in ways you might not expect.
Yeah, so we're going to be diving into this idea of overstory. Have you heard of this? These sort of invisible forces that shape our choices, in ways that we don't even realize.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these narratives, these overstories, they kind of act like an operating system for our social behavior. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think I get it. So let's maybe unpack this overstory idea a little bit.
Yeah.
When I hear overstory, I kind of think of like a forest, the canopy above everything else.
Yeah.
How does that apply to us?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So imagine you walk into a room and everyone's whispering. You might not know why they're whispering, but you probably start whispering too, right?
Yeah, probably out of politeness or something, just to,
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of like an overstory at work. It's like these unspoken rules or assumptions kind of guide our behavior without us even realizing it.
Okay, so it's like we're all swimming in this sea of shared narratives,
Yeah.
and we don't even realize it's like shaping, how we think and act.
You got it. And what's really interesting is how these overstories can create totally different outcomes, even in places that seem really similar on the surface. Researchers even have a name for this. They call it small area variation.
Small area variation. So is that like why some towns are obsessed with pickleball and others not so much?
Haha, maybe. But think about it on like a larger scale, things like healthcare, crime, even how people vote.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, where you live, the specific overstory of that place can have a huge impact on all those things.
Okay, so that's starting to make a little more sense. But do you have like a real world example of this small area variation thing? Something to really, I don't know, make it click.
Oh, absolutely. There was this fascinating study on tonsillectomies, that surgery where they take your tonsils out.
Yeah, yeah.
So researchers wanted to know, like, what makes a doctor decide to take out a kid's tonsils? And you know what they found?
Yeah.
It had very little to do with if the tonsils were actually a problem and way more to do with what town the kid lived in.
Railway, seriously.
Seriously. It all boiled down to the beliefs and practices of the doctors in that specific town. What was their shared overstory, right? So in some towns, doctors thought tonsils were basically useless, more trouble than they were worth. In those towns, tonsillectomies, super common, like almost everyone got them.
So you're saying just by being in that community, those doctors were influenced by this tonsillectomy overstory, even if they didn't realize it.
Exactly. And it's not just tonsillectomies. This overstory thing pops up everywhere. Take vaccination rates in Waldorf schools, for example.
Oh, right. I was curious about that. Waldorf schools, they often have way lower vaccination rates than other communities, even places with really similar demographics. Why is that?
Right. So Waldorf communities often really value individual exploration, critical thinking, sometimes even questioning expert opinions, which is, good in a lot of situations.
Right.
But when it comes to vaccines, their shared overstory, it often leans towards skepticism, which can be tough because even with public health campaigns and all the scientific evidence.
It's tough to overcome that.
Right.
It's fascinating how these unseen forces, these overstories, can have such a real impact. And it makes you wonder what other overstories are out there shaping our world, without us even realizing it.
Oh, yeah, there's definitely more. And to really understand that, we need to look at the folks who spread these overstories, the ones who amplify them and give them power. You know what I mean?
You mean like those influencers on social media? I knew it.
Well, they're definitely a part of it. But we're talking about a specific kind of influencer. Researchers actually call them superspreaders.
Superspreaders. Okay, now you're just messing with me. So what is a super spreader in this context? Like someone who's really good at spreading gossip?
Not quite. Think of it this way. In a pandemic, a super spreader is someone who spreads a virus way faster than other people.
Right.
So in this context, a super spreader is someone who's really influential in spreading these narratives, these overstories. It could be a doctor, a politician, a celebrity, even just that one friend we all have who's super persuasive.
Right. So not just anyone can be a super spreader. It's got to be someone who has, like, I don't know, some kind of authority on the topic.
Yeah, exactly. They've got to have that something extra that makes people listen.
Okay, so we got these overstories, these invisible scripts that shape our world. And then we've got super spreaders, the folks who make those scripts go viral.
Exactly. And when you connect the dots between those two things, you can start to understand some pretty wild stuff, like the case of Philippus Formes, for example.
Did Formes, the Miami healthcare fraud guy, what's he got to do with overstories?
Well, to understand S. Formes, we got to understand Miami. The city where he built, well, basically his whole empire on fraud.
So you're saying Miami itself played a role in his crimes?
Kind of, yeah. See, Miami's got this reputation, this overstory of being a place where the rules, well, they're a little more flexible.
Oh, you mean like a live and let live kind of thing?
Exactly. Or let's just say a culture of casual corruption and a general feeling of like distrust of authority.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying everyone in Miami is corrupt, but it is part of the city's, overstory. It's like this background hum that can be hard to ignore.
Especially for someone like S. Forms, who was new to the city, trying to, make it big, make its mark.
Exactly. It's like the city itself was whispering, hey, everyone's doing it.
And he just went along for the ride.
Exactly. And that's the power of these overstories. They can shape us in ways we don't realize, especially when you have those super spreaders amplifying them.
Yeah, you're right. It's like we're all susceptible to it, some more than others.
Definitely.
This idea of social engineering, though, of like intentionally shaping an overstory, that's when things get really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. And honestly, it happens way more than you might think. Take the Lawrence Tract, this community in Palo Alto, California. So these folks, they were really set on creating a racially integrated neighborhood back in the 1950s.
Yeah, a noble goal. I mean,
Yeah.
wanting everyone to live together in harmony.
Totally. And here's the thing, the way they went about it was, well, let's just say their methods were a little out there.
From what I read, it seemed like they were laser focused on keeping a specific racial balance. Almost like they were trying to, I don't know, design the perfect neighborhood. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And to make this like ideal neighborhood, they got kind of extreme. They would actually try to discourage, sometimes even block families from buying homes if it messed up their.
Their perfect balance.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's one of those things, right? Like it's fascinating, but also kind of messed up. It's like they wanted this integrated community so badly that they didn't see, or maybe didn't want to see how, I don't know.
How it could actually be harmful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's like their intentions were good, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right?
Totally. It makes you wonder, like, if people are willing to manipulate things like that, even for a good cause, what else could someone justify doing in the name of, I don't know, social good?
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just some small community in California. Turns out even Harvard University has a history of, let's just say, adjusting its demographic.
Wait, seriously, Harvard? I mean, I knew about the legacy admissions and all that, but I figured they stopped with the outright quotas a long time ago.
They did. But what came after was almost sneakier. Back in the 1920s, Harvard, they were dealing with what they called a Jewish problem.
A Jewish problem. So they had, what, too many Jewish students for their liking? That's messed up.
Yeah, it's pretty messed up. They felt like having a lot of Jewish students would, upset the balance of their mostly Protestant elite image.
So what'd they do? Just put up a sign that said, no more Jewish students.
No. They were more, let's say, subtle than that. They got rid of the official quotas, but then they start doing all these character assessments. They emphasized geographic diversity, that kind of thing. Oh, and they relied a lot on, subjective evaluations.
So basically they found a way to discriminate while making it look like it was all fair and square.
Exactly. They managed to keep the number of Jewish students down while still seeming like, a totally merit-based system.
Wow. It's crazy how some things never really change, huh? It makes you think about what overstories we're spreading today without even realizing it.
Absolutely. It's like we're always shaping the narrative, whether we mean to or not.
Right. Speaking of powerful narratives, I think we should probably talk about the Holocaust.
It's interesting, right? When you think about how huge, how horrific the Holocaust was, there was actually a long time where people didn't talk about it much, especially right after World War II.
I know, right? You'd think something that big, that awful, it'd be like all anyone could talk about.
You would think, right?
Why do you think there was that silence?
Well, I mean, part of it was probably just the trauma, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like a lot of survivors, they didn't want to relive those experiences.
And nobody wanted to, force them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I also think the overstory at the time played a big role.
What do you mean?
Think about it. Right after the war, everyone wanted to focus on rebuilding, moving on, coming together against new threats like the Cold War.
So the Holocaust didn't really fit into that.
Exactly. It was too complex, too morally messy for that moment in time.
So then how did we go from avoiding the topic to like what we have now where it's remembered and studied so much more?
That's the fascinating part. It was actually a TV show that really changed things. That miniseries, Holocaust from 1978.
Seriously,
Wow.
Holocaust. I had no idea.
Yeah. And it was huge. I mean, it was fiction, but it brought the Holocaust into people's living rooms,
Yeah.
made it something they couldn't ignore anymore.
It's amazing how powerful a story can be, right? Like how it can take something unimaginable and make it real, make it something you have to confront. It
Absolutely.
makes you wonder what other overstories are out there right now that need that kind of shift, you know? What stories are waiting to be told?
Right. And what will it take to make people listen?
It's a good question. One we'll have to ponder another time. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another overstory that's undergone a dramatic transformation. The fight for gay marriage. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, right? Like a TV show helping to change how people thought about something as huge as the Holocaust.
It's really something, isn't it? How stories can sneak into our minds and change how we see things. And it makes you wonder, did that shift, that openness after the Holocaust miniseries, maybe it helped pave the way for other big changes, like, for example, the fight for gay marriage?
Oh, okay, now that's a connection I wouldn't have made. I mean, those two things seem like totally unrelated at first glance.
Right. But think about it. Just a few decades ago, gay marriage. It was unthinkable to most people. The overstory, the dominant narrative, it was all about traditional marriage. And a lot of that came from, well, let's just say misinformation and prejudice.
Yeah, it was that long ago that just talking about being gay was taboo.
Exactly. So the fight for gay marriage, it wasn't just about laws, right? It was about changing hearts and minds, about shifting that whole deeply ingrained overstory. And just like with the Holocaust, it took something huge to get things moving.
Okay, so what was the big event for gay rights? Was it a court case?
Yeah.
A protest? What was it?
Believe it or not, it was another TV show, Will and Grace.
Will and Grace, get out of here. I mean, I love that show, but I never thought of it as like political or anything.
See, and that was the genius of it, right? It wasn't trying to be some big statement. It was just funny. It was about friendship and love. And oh, yeah, one of the main characters was gay.
So just by showing a gay character living a normal life, Will and Grace started to like chip away at that old overstory.
Bingo. It normalized something that had been seen as different, wrong even. It helped people connect with gay characters, see them as people, and that made it easier to support their rights.
It's incredible. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the simplest things, huh?
Totally. A good story, well told, can change the world. And speaking of stories that need to be told, let's talk about the opioid crisis.
Right, because it's more than just addiction, right? Like we've been talking about with these other overstories, there's always more going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. It's about how we see pain, how we think about medicine, who we trust
Yeah,
to tell us what's right.
definitely. And it's crazy how different the opioid crisis has been in different places. Take Indiana and Illinois, for instance. They're right next to each other, similar people, similar problems, but Indiana, way more opioid overdoses.
It's a head scratcher, isn't it? How can two places so similar be so different? And it goes back to those overstories, those beliefs that shape our actions. Indiana's overstory around opioids. It was heavily influenced by this guy, Paul Madden, a lawyer from California back in the 1930s.
Paul Madden, never heard of him.
Most people haven't. But his impact on how we deal with opioids, huge. He was obsessed with this idea of controlling opioids through triplicate prescriptions.
Triplicate, like 3 copies of every prescription. Sounds like a pain.
It was, but it kind of worked. See, Madden, he thought doctors were the problem, that they were too quick to prescribe opioids.
So his system was supposed to make it harder to get those prescriptions.
Exactly. 3 copies. One for the doctor, one for the pharmacy, one for the government. The idea was to make doctors think twice before handing out opioids like candy.
Okay, but how did this California lawyer end up influencing Indiana's whole overstory about opioids?
Well, Madden's first big target, it was this crooked doctor in San Francisco, Nathan Hausman. He was basically running a pill mill, handing out opioids to anyone who asked.
Wait, Hausman? Wasn't he the doctor who got rich off that patient he kept hooked on opioids for years?
That's him. So Hausman, he became Madden's poster boy, right? Proof that doctors were the problem. And that story, that overstory, it spread like wildfire. It influenced how doctors all over the country thought about opioids for decades.
So even though most people had never heard of Madden or Hausman, their story changed how a whole generation of doctors treated pain.
Exactly. And that brings us to Purdue Pharma and OxyContin.
Purdue Pharma. Talk about manipulating the overstory.
They were masters at it. See, because of that Madden overstory, doctors already believed that opioid addiction was rare. So Purdue swoops in with OxyContin, their new wonder drug, claiming it's less addictive, totally safe for long-term use, all that.
And they went after those superspreader doctors, right? The ones who saw tons of patients, the big prescribers.
Exactly. They knew if they could convince those doctors, OxyContin would be everywhere. And, well, that's exactly what happens. OxyContin sales went through the roof, and unfortunately, so did addiction rates.
It's scary how easily we can be fooled, right? How a good story, even if it's a lie, can blind us to the truth.
It's a powerful reminder that these narratives, these overstories, they matter. They shape how we see the world, the choices we make, even our own lives.
So what can we do? If we're swimming in these overstories all the time, how do we protect ourselves?
That is the million-dollar question. The first step is simple. Be aware. We got to start recognizing these overstories for what they are. Stories, not the absolute truth, just one way of seeing things.
So be more critical, ask more questions. Don't just accept what we hear.
Exactly. Challenge those assumptions, look for different perspectives, especially when someone's trying to sell you something.
Like that saying, trust but verify. Or in this case, listen but question everything.
Love it. And remember, you can be part of the overstory too, you know? You can choose to spread stories that bring people together, that fight for what's right.
We all have a voice, and we can use it to make the world a better, more truthful place.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think we're about out of time. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.